to our virtual reading group extra for The Messiness of Progress, Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall and David Hume's Essays and Histories. I'm Christy Lynn Horpedahl, the assistant editor at AdamSmithWorks, and I have the pleasure of being the Liberty Fund representative in this reading group. Hilary Mantel's modern masterpiece tells the story of Thomas Cromwell's rise. Mantel's Cromwell is a financial, religious, and intellectual visionary in the great Whig history tradition, which makes it especially interesting to read alongside of David Hume's essays on history and the rise of the modern liberal state. The group is led by Dr. Shannon Chamberlain from the Great Book School, St. John's College. She teaches at their campus in beautiful Santa Fe, New Mexico. Shannon is here to help us think about these works, the nature of the past and attempts to understand it, and just how much freedom an individual has over themselves and the world around them. Hello, Shannon. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Christy.
Of course. A little context for the readings. For the first session, we read the first part of Wolf Hall and chapter 29 of volume 3 of Hume's History of England. This is the early to mid 1500s. In Wolf Hall, Thomas begins as a beaten, bloody blacksmith's son, leaving Putney, who becomes an indispensable and beloved disciple to the worldly and powerful Cardinal Wolsey. He is happily married to Liz, a widow, with city contacts and some money behind her, which was very important to him in a wife. But we're gonna, in Hume's history, we get wars, invasions, ransoms, and my favorite part, tax revolts. And we also get a digression on why state-sponsored religion is a good thing from Hume's perspective. Anne Boleyn is in the wings. Henry VIII's focus is turning from wars to secession. But before we move on to the personalities, we're going to start with the history. So Mantel is writing almost 500 years after these events. Even Hume is writing about them more than 200 years later. So what is it about this time in history that keeps authors and readers looking backwards towards this moment?
I think in some ways it's the first recognizably modern moment. All the things that you mentioned there, war, those are perpetual, facts of human history. But when you talked about the tax revolt, I was thinking about that. This is a moment where there's a lot of instability, and I think that there's a lot of desire to rethink of the way things have been done. I was reading something the other day that said that a lot of what seems to have perpetuated the Renaissance was the Black Plague. It led to labor instability, which sounds very frighteningly familiar, and it led to the consolidation of property. Third of your population dies. You're going to have some economic shocks, and those economic shocks were, they were shocking. They were horrible for the people who were living through it, but they were also kind of productive in a way. They led to, sort of the collapse of feudalism, and the sort of opportunities for Thomas Cromwell that we're seeing at the beginning of Wolf Hall.
This is a clear historical moment when ambitious men and women can seize opportunities. Some turn out good, some bad, some seem good and then become bad. What do you think are a few moments from these readings that are worth paying particular attention to?
So from the Hume, we talked a little bit about this, but his portrayal of Cardinal Wolsey, I think, is very interesting. Cardinal Wolsey is kind of a precursor of Cromwell in some ways, that he's from a slightly better background. He was a butcher's son as opposed to a blacksmith's son. I can't say that I completely understand all of the class hierarchies here, but this seems to have been better. I think Mantel refers to him as a milk-fed butcher's son or something like that. So he didn't have the sort of instability that Cromwell had in his early ages. But he was still, and the way that he sort of comes into the Tudor orbit is through the church, and then Hume talks a lot about that, about how the politics and the religion are kind of mapping and diverting from each other here. And so, what what Thomas Wolsey is able to do is use the fact that he's a churchman um, to make a case that he's respectable enough to be the Chancellor of England. But that's, as we can see from the novel, that wasn't an uncontroversial thing either. His background was regarded as quite lowly, and this is some of the animus against him. And so I think that was a really interesting moment for me, where the two readings, the Mantel and the Hume, kind of dovetailed. And as we talked a little bit about in the VRG, it seems like Hume is a little bit more skeptical of Wolsey than Mantel is at first. He's a figure that Thomas Cromwell definitely admires in the novel, and so therefore we kind of end up taking on that same sort of admiration. But the other sort of background to the readings. We didn't read this chapter from Hume because I thought it was a little bit too background, but it's interesting nonetheless. This is all the moment after the Wars of the Roses. And this was this dynastic struggle in England. And there was a lot of instability in that, in that, I think it was about a 40-year period, where the king was just switching all the time, and it wasn't clear what the succession was. And that's really what kind of allows Thomas Cromwell to find his way in here, is that Henry VIII was extremely worried about reproducing that instability, because he only had a daughter at that point from Catherine of Aragon, who at the advanced age of 42 could definitely not reproduce anymore, right? No, it's actually, that's one of the things I really like about the Mantel, is that it's it's pretty much sympathetic to everybody, including Catherine of Aragon. She loses all of those children. Think about what that must have been like for all of these people. There's I think one case Mantel talks about where, I don't know, it has 19 children and one survives to adulthood. So that's really the sort of dynastic struggle that is the background here. And it's easy to say, well, it's love and passion for Anne Boleyn that drives Henry to do the things that he does, and that's probably true, but there's also just this fact looming in his head that if he leaves a 16-year-old girl the throne, there's going to be some problems. And so that's really what Thomas Cromwell comes in, because he promises to fix this for him. I'm gonna get you the wife you want, and you can have some more kids, and it's all going to be fine.
Yeah, and I think they are different questions, right? Who he chooses after he throws over Catherine is different from the fact of throwing over Catherine, although I think it's easy to treat them as the same decision. But you don't know.
Yeah.
So we've definitely moved into talking about the personalities, and I want to stick with that. And I do think that you're right that Mantel is she's so sympathetic to her characters, especially Thomas Cromwell. And you made a comment in our reading group about Thomas Cromwell's virtues, and it made me laugh a little, because usually he stood up against men like Martin Luther and Thomas More, and you would say the virtues of Thomas Cromwell. So I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about, what do you think that Cromwell's virtues are, and how do you think that Mantel shows those in Wolf Hall?
Well, I think one of the things that stands out to me, especially on this reading, when I'm thinking about Hume and modernity and all of these things, is that he's in some ways a kind of recognizably ordinary guy. One of the wonderful things about the novel is just the sort of textural detail that goes into her recreation of the Tudor world here. But the motivation for that textural detail is Thomas Cromwell noticing these things, like appreciating what people are wearing. There's a scene in the part we're reading for next week where Wolsey comes in and he says, "Cost me out," and Thomas Cromwell, appraises, because he was a cloth merchant, how much it took to dress Cardinal Wolsey, and it's just it's a sort of wonderful wonderful thing to notice these. He's a man who can appreciate a finely glazed piece of glass or something, and that's and so that's one of his virtues, I think, is he just likes life. He likes to live. He has very little patience for the sort of otherworldly focus of somebody like Thomas More. There's the wonderful line, of course, about certainties and why as he gets older, all of the old facts of the world collapse, but for Thomas More, they become more certain. But it's also, the austerity of Thomas More that is contrasted to Cromwell's sort of bonhomie and appreciation for the finer things in life. And so I think that's one of his virtues, and I think that helps him understand Henry in a way. And it's I think for the passage we read there this week. There's all this talk about how he's able to procure these goods from abroad that nobody else can seem to get a hold of. He can negotiate with a Venetian rug merchant for you and that sort of thing. And it's easy to maybe adopt some of what must have been the attitude of the time, and which still exists today. That Thomas More had his eyes on a different world and all of that, but I don't know, there's something unappealing ultimately about somebody who can't seem to focus on what's going on around them, and that seems to be what Thomas More is. He's somebody who's so lost in his not just in his books, because Thomas Cromwell is himself portrayed as a reader and somebody who appreciates that sort of thing too, but just lost to another world in a way that Thomas Cromwell seems like he's present all the time.
That's interesting that also might be part of his connection with King Henry, right? Is knowing that you have to focus on the thing in front of you in addition to the other stuff that's in the background. There's a practical focus that you need to be successful, that Cardinal Wolsey has as well.
Yeah, Cardinal Wolsey definitely does. He's not your typical churchman, which is one of the sort of wonderful things about Mantel's portrait of him. But when you were saying that, Christy, I was thinking for this year I read Cato with my sophomores, and we talked a lot about that, about how Cato, he was so good in some ways and so upright, and so unwilling to compromise, that he was a bad politician. And so he never really ended up accomplishing any of the good things that he wanted to. He never, really did any good for anybody, despite upholding his high moral principles. And now I'm remembering that in A Man for All Seasons, Thomas More is compared to Cato. So this is kind of making sense to me now.
Well, I'll note that there are no works by Thomas Cromwell on the St. John's College curriculum. So
I don't think he wrote much.
Point for Cato. Point for Thomas More. No.
Yeah, we don't read Caesar either.
No, we don't. But we do. You do get to read David Hume, although you read a work of David Hume's that I have come to understand is not a work that he necessarily continued to think was a good representation of him as he got older. So the treatise on human nature. So my understanding is he liked this work less and less as he aged. But I think even reading the histories, you can see a lot of Hume's beliefs about human nature. And I think you mentioned this in the group as well. Even though he's trying to do something different in his history than he is in an essay or a treatise. So I was curious what you think, how much of the man of David Hume do you see when you're reading the history? Do you think as a personality he's dominating his work, or do you think he does a good job of distancing himself and trying to present the history as a more objective work?
I think it's kind of impossible sometimes to, especially in this period, take yourself out of the history and not take a side on things. And there's just so much wonderful Hume wit in the histories. Just these little offhand asides where he sort of reveals himself and reveals his cards. When you were talking there, one of the reasons that he ended up kind of repudiating the treatise was that I don't know, there's this moment in the treatise, I don't know if you remember it from when you were a student, where he says that so he goes through all of these skeptical reasons why we shouldn't believe in anything, even if the sun is going to come up tomorrow. It's just it's probability. It's all induction, and that's not on a very firm foundation. And then he has this moment where he says, yeah, and sometimes this gives me a sort of existential dread of the world. And what restores me is going into company and playing backgammon with my friends. And I think later on in his life, one of the things that he mentioned to somebody was that he wished that he'd kind of stopped things there. And then, with the history, for all of that skepticism, for all of that sort of existential, crisis about what's going to happen next, maybe the nice thing about history for him is that you kind of know what's going to happen next. And that's where I see one of the interesting things in his history is that he has to represent, he knows what's going to happen. He has an idea of where this is heading, and so he can have an interpretation of it. And that's, kind of one of the interesting things about historical fiction versus just history, is that when you write historical fiction, you have to remember that your characters don't know how things are going to turn out. They don't necessarily have an interpretation. They don't have this grand Whig history narrative of we go through all of this crisis of religion in the 17th century, which starts in this Tudor era, and then everything turns out fine because of the Enlightenment. We don't have that sort of benefit when we read historical fiction. And I think for me that's one of the values of reading historical fiction, is that you have to enter that mindset where you don't know what the trajectory of history is going to be. You don't, if you're Thomas Cromwell, you don't know if it's going to be okay for the scriptures to be printed in English someday. And I think that's kind of wonderful. I love grand historical narratives. As you know, I really love Hume's history, but I also find that valuable thinking, when we think about our own times. We try to use history in the way that I did at the beginning of this, to say, well, sometimes pandemics produce, this chaos that ends up being good, but I don't know if that's going to happen or not. So if somebody is writing historical fiction about this era, they'll feel the same things that I do, the same uncertainty, the same, desire to know what's going to happen, but the impossibility of knowing what's going to happen.
I thought Mantel did that really beautifully in the character of Cavendish, when he sees Thomas Cromwell holding what he doesn't know it's his daughter's prayer book, but his daughter's prayer book, and crying, and he says, Cromwell's reading a prayer book. Cromwell is crying, right? Like, things are actually very bad right now. And how human that is, right? To reach a moment where you're kind of going along doing what you think is best. And then you could think about this with the pandemic too, right? At the beginning, you sort of think like, oh, this is a bad flu. Oh, this is a normal part of the world. But then you have a moment where all of a sudden you realize this is different. This is different than what my experience has ever been before, the experience in recent memory. I love that I think Mantel does it really well. And I think it's a good argument for reading historical fiction in addition to reading histories. I also like that you mentioned how funny Hume is, because I forget that when I don't read him for a while, and it's always a pleasure to go back. Just one of my favorite lines was when he said, the Romish church began to perceive that she overabounded in monks, and she wanted some supply of learning. And it's so fun to read that and to hear Hume's voice and humor in that. Mantel also, we had one of our reading group participants say she laughed out loud several times when Cromwell's talking or when Cromwell's reflecting on something that's happened. Do you have any moments from either of the readings that you find particularly funny or that kind of make you laugh or chuckle?
One of the ones that I love is the conversation between Thomas Cromwell and Morgan Williams, who's his Welsh brother-in-law, I think. And one of the, the great moments at the end of that conversation is when Cromwell starts speaking in Welsh to him, and he's so astonished that Cromwell's picked up any Welsh. And in typical Cromwell fashion, what he wishes him as he's departing for the continent and the rest of his life is that his business will be good in Welsh. And,
Did you think I was just here for the suppers?
Yeah, right.
He thinks but doesn't say, right?
Yeah. I just thought that was great. Let's see what else. I really like the scene. We talked about this one a little bit, where he's telling the Flemish merchants how much to bribe. What would be an acceptable bribe, I think. And one of the Welsh merchants says something like, "I find these coins surplus." I thought, oh, that's just such a wonderful sort of, I don't know, just a quick peek into the way that things must have been back then.
And the huge, as you have people from these different cultures coming together, the huge benefit to someone like Cromwell, who can see what the difference is and make a jump or make a leap about what a person needs or what they're misunderstanding. There's an opportunity for a man like Cromwell in that world where cultures are colliding that's different from the opportunities for someone who just deeply understands their own culture but that can't look beyond it. I think that's another moment of modernity that we see in these books. Well, this conversation, which I hope will not be our last on these readings, is in part inspired by our virtual reading group hosted by Liberty Fund. Thanks for watching. We hope you'll join us at a future reading group. You can find links to the virtual reading group pages in the video notes. And for the lovers of fictionalized English history, we also have a few VRG extras with Sarah Squire from when we did William Shakespeare's Henry IV tetralogy, which includes Richard II. So I'll drop those in the notes as well for people who want to look at some other stuff that we've produced. Thanks again, Shannon, for being here with us. And I hope we get to talk again soon.
Thank you, Christy.